Chapter 5. From the top platform of an old, seldom-used lookout tower, a prospect tower as it was formerly termed, it stood on a wooded hill 800 feet high, called Mount Ettrick, in one of the fairest New England's fair estates. An adventurous summer tourist, Miranda or Mary, Tom or Jim, whose penciled names were almost obliterated by the balustrade, might observe a vast sea of greenery composed mainly of maple, beech, tacamahac, and pine. Some 5 miles west, a slender white church steeple marked the spot where nestled the small town of Onquedo, once famous for its springs. 3 miles north, in a riverside clearing, at the foot of a grassy knoll, one could distinguish the gables of an ornate house variously known as Cook's Place, Cook's Castle, or the Pines, its initial appellation. Along the south side of Mount Ettrick, a state highway continued east after passing through Onquedo. Numerous dirt roads and foot trails crisscrossed the timbered plain within the triangle of that limited but somewhat tortuous hypnotus of the rural paved road that weaved northeast from Onquedo to the Pines, the long cathetus of the state highway just mentioned, and the short cathetus of a river spanned by a steel bridge near Mount Ettrick and a wooden one near Cook's. On a dull, warm day in the summer of 1954, Mary or Elmira, or for that matter Wolfgang von Goethe, whose names had been carved in the balustrade by some old-fashioned wag, might have noticed an automobile that had turned off the highway just before reaching the bridge and was now nosing and poking its way, and that, in a maze of doubtful roads, it moved warily and unsteadily, and whenever it changed its mind, it would slow down and raise dust behind like a back-kicking dog. At times it might seem to a less sympathetic soul than our imagined observer that this pale blue, egg-shaped two-door sedan of uncertain age and in mediocre condition was manned by an idiot. Actually, its driver was Professor Timothy Pnin of Waynedale College. Pnin had started taking lessons of the Waynedale driving school early in the year, but true understanding, as he put it, had come to him only when, a couple of months later, he had been laid up with a sore back and had done nothing but study with deep enjoyment the 40-page driver's manual, issued by the state government in collaboration with another expert in the article on automobile in the Encyclopedia Americana, with illustrations of transmissions and carburetors and brakes, and a member of the Glydian Tour, circa 1905, struck the mud of a country road among depressing surroundings. Then and only then was the dual nature of his initial inklings transcended at last as he lay on his sickbed, wiggling his toes and shifting phantom gears. During actual lessons with a harsh instructor who cramped his style, issued unnecessary directives and yelps of technical slang, tried to wrestle the wheel from him at corners, and kept irritating a calm and intelligent pupil with expressions of vulgar detraction. Pnin had been totally unable to combine perceptually the car he was driving in his mind with the car he was driving on the road. Now the two fused at last. If he failed the first time he took his driver's license test, it was mainly because he started an argument with the examiner in an ill-timed effort to prove that nothing could be more humiliating to a rational creature than being required to encourage the development of a base conditional reflex by stopping at a red light when there was not an earthly soul around, heeled or wheeled. He was more circumspect the next time and passed. An irresistible senior enrolled in his Russian language course. Marilyn Hahn sold him for $100 her humble old car. She was getting married to the owner of a far greater machine. The trip from Waynedale to Onquedo, with an overnight stop at the tourist home, had been slow and difficult but uneventful. Just before entering Onquedo, he had pulled up at a gas station and had got out for a breath of country air. An inscrutable white sky hung over a clover field, and from a pile of fir wood near a shack came a rooster's cry, jagged and gaudy, a vocal coxcomb. Some chance information on the part of this slightly hoarse bird, combined with the warm wind pressing itself against Pnin in search of attention, recognition, anything, briefly reminded him of a dim, dead day when he, a Petrograd University freshman, had arrived at the small station of a Baltic summer resort And the sounds and the smells and the sadness, kind of muggy, said the hairy-armed attendant as he started to wipe the windshield. Pnin took a letter out of his wallet, unfolded the tiny mimeographed sketch map attached to it, and asked the attendant how far was the church at which one's place was supposed to turn left to reach Cook's place. It was really striking how the man resembled Pnin's colleague at Wendell College, Dr. Hagen, one of those random likenesses as pointless as a bad pun. Well, there is a better way to get there, said the false Hagen. These trucks have messed up that road, and besides, you won't like the way it winds. Now you just drive through the town, 5 miles out of Onquedo, just after you pass the trail to Mount Ettrick on your left, and just before reaching the bridge, take the first left turn. It is a good gravel road. He stepped briskly around the hood and lunged with his rag at the windshield from the other side. You turn north and go on bearing north at each crossing. There are quite a few logging trails in those woods, but you just bear north and you get to Cook's at 12 minutes flat. You can't miss it. Pnin had now been in the Maze Forest roads for about an hour, and had come to the conclusion that bear north, and in fact the word north itself, meant nothing to him. He also could not explain what had compelled him, a rational being, to listen to a chance busybody instead of firmly following the pedantically precise instructions that his friend Alexander Petrovich Kukolnikov, known locally as Al Cook, had sent him when inviting him to spend the summer at its large and hospitable country house. Our luckless car operator had by now lost himself too thoroughly to be able to go back to the highway, and since he had little experience in maneuvering on rutty, narrow roads, with ditches and even ravines gaping on either side, his various indecisions and gropings took those bizarre visual forms that an observer on the lookout tower might have followed with a compassionate eye, but there was no living creature in that forlorn and listless upper region except for an ant who had his own troubles, having after hours of inept perseverance somehow reached the upper platform and the balustrade, his autostrada, and was getting all bothered and baffled much in the same way as that preposterous toy car progressing below. The wind had subsided. Under the pale sky the sea of tree-tops seemed to harbor no life. Presently, however, a gunshot popped, and a twig leaped into the sky. The dense upper boss of that part of the otherwise stirless forest started to move in a receding sequence of shakes or jumps with a swinging lilt from tree to tree, after which it was all still again. Another minute passed, and then everything happened at once. The ant found an upright beam leading to the roof of the tower and started to ascend it with a renewed zest. The sun appeared, and Pnin, at the height of hopelessness, found himself on a paved road with a rusty but still glistening sign directing wayfarers to the pines. Al Cook was a son of Pyotr Kukolnikov, wealthy Moscow merchant, old believers and descendants. Self-made man, Marcinas, and philanthropist, the famous Kukolnikov, who under the last Tsar had been twice imprisoned in a fairly comfortable fortress for giving financial assistance to social revolutionary groups, terrorists mainly, and under Lenin had been put to death as an imperialistic spy after almost a week of medieval tortures in a Soviet jail. His family reached America via Harbin around 1925, and young Cook, by dint of quiet perseverance, practical acumen, and some scientific training, rose to a high and secure position in a great chemical concern. A kindly, very reserved man of stocky build, with a large, immobile face, and was tied up in the middle of a neat little pince-nez. He looked what he was: a business executive, a mason, a golfer, a prosperous and cautious man. He spoke beautifully correct, neutral English, with only the softest shadow of a Slavic accent, and was delightful host of the silent variety, with a twinkling eye and a highball in each hand. And only when some very old and beloved Russian friend was his midnight guest would Alexander Petrovich suddenly start to discuss God, Lermontov, liberty, and divulge a hereditary streak of rash idealism that would have greatly confused a Marxist eavesdropper. He married Susan Marshall, the attractive, voluble, blonde daughter of Charles G. Marshall, the inventor, because one could not imagine Alexander and Susan otherwise than raising a huge, healthy family. It came as a shock to me and other well-wishers to learn that as the result of an operation, Susan would remain childless all her life. They were still young, loved each other with a sort of old-world simplicity and integrity very soothing to observe, and instead of populating their country place with children and grandchildren, they collected every even year summer elderly Russians, cooks, fathers, or uncles, as it were. And odd year summers they would have Amerikansky Americans, Alexander's business acquaintances, or Susan's relatives and friends. This was the first time Pnin was coming to the Pines, but I had been there before. Immigrant Russians, liberals, and intellectuals who had left Russia around 1920 could be found swarming all over the place. You would find them in every patch of speckled shade, sitting on rustic benches and discussing emigre writers, Bunin, Aldanov, Sirin, lying suspended in hammocks with the Sunday issue of Russian-language newspaper over their faces in traditional defense against flies, sipping tea with jam on the veranda, walking in the woods and wondering about the edibility of local toadstools. Samuel Lvovich Shaplyansky, a large, majestically calm old gentleman, and small, excitable, stuttering Count Fyodor Nikitich Poroshin, both of whom were around 1920 have been members of one of these heroic regional governments that were formed in the Russian provinces by democratic groups to withstand Bolshevik dictatorship, would pace the avenue of the Pines and discuss the tactics to be adopted at that next joint meeting of the Free Russia Committee, which they had founded in New York with another younger anti-communist organization. From a pavilion half smothered by locust trees came fragments of a heated exchange between Professor Bolotov, who taught the history of philosophy, and Professor Chateau, who taught the philosophy of history. Reality is duration. One voice, Bolotov's, would boom, "It is not," the other would cry, "A soap bubble as real as a fossil tooth." Pnin and Chateau, both born in the late 90s of the 19th century, were comparative youngsters. Most of the other men had seen 60 and trudged on. On the other hand, a few of the ladies, such as Countess Poroshin and Madame Bolotov, were still in their late 40s, and thanks to the hygienic atmosphere of the New World, had not only preserved but improved their good looks. Some parents brought their offspring with them, healthy, tall, indolent, difficult American children of college age, with no sense of nature and no Russian, and no interest whatsoever in the niceties of their parents' backgrounds and pasts. They seemed to live at the Pines on a physical and mental plane entirely different from that of their parents, now and then passing from their own level to ours through a kind of interdimensional shimmer, responding curtly to a well-meaning Russian joke or anxious piece of advice, and then fading away again, keeping always aloof, so that one felt one had engendered a brood of elves, and preferring any Unquedo store product, any sort of canned goods, to the marvelous Russian foods provided by the Kuklanakov household at loud, long dinners on the screened porch. With great distress, Poroshin would say of his children, Igor and Olga, college sophomores, "My twins are exasperating. When I see them at home during breakfast and dinner and try to tell them most interesting, most exciting things, for instance about local elective and self-government in the Russian far north in the 17th century, or say something about the history of the first medical schools in Russia. There is, by the way, an excellent monograph of Chistovich on the subject, published in 1883. They simply wander off and turn the radio in their rooms. Both young people were around the summers Pnin was invited to the Pines, but they stayed invisible, and they would have been hideously bored in this out-of-the-way place had not Olga's admirer, a college boy whose surname nobody seemed to know, arrived from Boston for the weekend for a spectacular car, and had not Igor found a conventional companion in Nina, the Bolotov girl, a handsome slattern with Egyptian eyes and brown limbs, who went to a dancing school in New York. The household was looked after by Praskovia, a sturdy 60-year-old woman of the people, with the vivacity of 1 years younger. It was an exhilarating sight to watch her as she stood on the back porch, surveying the chickens, knuckles on hips, dressed in baggy homemade shorts and matronly blouse with rhinestones. She had nursed Alexander and his brother when both were children in Harbin, and now she helped her household duties by her husband, a gloomy and stolid Cossack, whose main passions in life were amateur bookbinding, a self-taught and almost pathological process that he was impelled to inflict upon any old catalogue or pulp magazine that came his way, the making of fruit liquors, the killing of small forest animals, Of that season's guests, Pnin knew well Professor Chateau, a friend of his youth, and with whom he had attended the University of Prague in the early 20s. And he was also well acquainted with the Bolotovs, whom he had last seen in 1949, when he welcomed them with a speech of formal dinner given them by the Association of Russian Immigrant Scholars at the Barbizon Plaza upon the occasion of Bolotov's arrival from France. Personally, I never cared much for Bolotov and his philosophical works, which so oddly combine the obscure and the trite. The man's achievement is perhaps a mountain, but a mountain of platitudes. I have always liked, however, Varvara, the seedy philosopher's exuberant books and wife. When she first visited the Pines in 1951, she had never seen the New England countryside before. Its birches and bilberries deceived her into placing mentally Lake Onqueto not on the parallel of, say, Lake Orida in the Balkans, where it belonged, but on that of Lake Onega in the northern Russia, where she had spent her first 15 summers before fleeing for the Bolsheviks to Western Europe with her Aunt Lydia Vinogradov, the well-known feminist and social worker. Consequently, the sight of a hummingbird in probing flight or a catalpa in ample bloom produced upon Varvara the effect of some unnatural or exotic vision. More fabulous than pictures in a bestiary were to her the tremendous porcupines that came to gnaw at the delicious, gamey old wood of the house, or the elegant, eerie little skunks that sampled the cat's milk in the backyard. She was enchanted by the number of plants and creatures could not identify, mistook yellow warblers for stray canaries, and on the occasion of Susan's birthday was known to have fought with pride, panting enthusiasm, for the ornamentation of the dinner table, a profusion of beautiful poison ivy leaves hugged to her pink freckled breast. The Bolotovs and Madame Spoliansky, a little lean woman in slacks, were the first people to see Pnin as he was cautiously turned into a sandy avenue, bordered with wild lupines, and sitting very straight, stiffly clutching the steering wheel as if he were a farmer more used to the tractor than to his car, entered at 10 miles an hour in his first gear. The grove of old, disheveled, curiously authentic-looking pines that separated the paved road from Cook's Castle. Varvara buoyantly rose from the seat of the pavilion where she and Rosa Shapolyansky had just discovered Bolotov reading a battered book and smoking a forbidden cigarette. She greeted Pnin with the clapping of her hands, while her husband showed as much geniality as he was capable of by slowly waving the book he had closed on his thumb to mark the place. Pnin killed the motor and sat beaming at his friends. The collar of his green sports shirt was undone. His partly unzipped windbreaker seemed too tight for his impressive torso. His bronze bald head with the puckered brow and conspicuous vernacular vein on his temple bent low as he wrestled with the door handle and finally dived out of the car. Automobile, costume nu piramo Americanets, a veritable American. Piramo Eisenhower, said Varvara, and introduced Pnin to Rosa Abramovna Shpolyansky. We had some mutual friends 40 years ago, remarked that lady, peering at Pnin with curiosity. Oh, let us not mention such astronomical figures, said Bolotov, approaching and replacing with a grass blade the thumb he had just been using as a bookmarker. You know, he continued, shaking Pnin's hand, I am reading Anna Karenine for the 7th time, and I derive as much rapture as I did not 40 but 60 years ago when I was a lad of 7, and every time one discovers new things. For instance, I notice now that Lvov Nikolaich does not know on what day his novel starts. It seems to be Friday, because that is the day the clockman comes to wind up the clocks in the Oblonsky house. But it is also Thursday, as mentioned in the conversation at the skating rink between Levon and Kitty's mother. What on earth does it matter? Cried Varvara. Who on earth wants to know the exact day? I can tell you the exact day, said Pnin, blinking in the broken sunlight and inhaling the remembered tang of northern pines. The action of the novel starts in the beginning of 1872, namely on Friday, February the 23rd, in the New Style. In his morning paper, Oblonsky reads that the boost is rumored to have proceeded to Wiesbaden. This is, of course, Count Friedrich Ferdinand von Beust, who had just been appointed Austrian ambassador to the court of St. James. After presenting his credentials, Beust had gone to the continent for a rather protracted Christmas vacation, had spent there 2 months with his family, and was now returning to London, where, according to his own memoirs in 2 volumes, preparations were underway for the Thanksgiving service to be held in St. Paul's on February the 27th for the recovering from typhoid fever of the Prince of Wales. However, Odnako, it really is hot here. Et jarko je uvas. I think I shall now present myself before the most luminous orbs, Prishveti Oki, jocular, of Alexander Petrovich, and then go for a dip. Okovsnutsia, also jocular, in the river he so vividly describes in his letter. Alexander Petrovich is away till Monday, on business or pleasure, said Varvara Bolotov, but I think you will find Susanna Karlovna sunbathing on her favorite lawn behind the house. Shout before you approach too near. Cook's Castle was a 3-story brick and timber mansion, built around 1860, partly rebuilt half a century later, when Susan's father purchased it from the Dudley Green family in order to make of it a select resort hotel for the richer patrons of the curative Oquendo Springs. It was an elaborate and ugly building in a mongrel style, with the Gothic bristling through the remnants of French and Florentine, and when originally designed might have belonged to the variety which Samuel Sloane, an architect of the time, classified as an irregular northern villa well adapted to the highest requirements of social life, and called northern because of the aspiring tendency of its roof and towers. The piquancy of these pinnacles and the merry, somewhat even inebriated air of the mansion had of having been composed of several smaller northern villas, hoisted into mid-air and knocked together anyhow, with parts of unassimilated roofs, half-hearted gables, cornices, rustic quoins, and other projections sticking out on all sides, had alas but briefly attracted tourists. By 1920 the Oquendo waters had mysteriously lost whatever magic they had contained, and after her father's death Susan had vainly tried to sell the Pines, since they had another more comfortable house in the residential quarter of the industrial city where her husband worked. However, now they had got accustomed to use the castle for entertaining their numerous friends, Susan was glad the meek, beloved monster had found no purchaser. Within, the diversity was as great as without. 4 spacious rooms opened from the large hall that retained something of its house-like stage in the generous dimensions of the grate. The handrail of the stairs and at least one of its spindles dated from 1720, having been transferred to the house while it was being built from a far older one whose very site was no longer exactly known. Very ancient, too, were the beautiful sideboard panels of game and fish in the dining room, in the half a dozen rooms of which each of the upper floors consisted, and in 2 wings of the rear. One could discover among disparate pieces of furniture some charming satinwood bureau, some romantic rosewood sofa, but also all kinds of bulky and miserable articles, broken chairs, dusty marble-topped tables, morose étagères with bits of dark-looking glass in the back, as mournful as the eyes of old apes. The chamber Pnin got was pleasant southeast one on the upper floor. It had remnants of gilt paper on the walls, an army cot, a plain washstand, and all kinds of shelves, brackets, and scrollwork moldings. Pnin shook open the casement, smiled at the smiling forest, again remembered a distant day in the country, and presently walked down, clad in a navy blue bathrobe, and wearing on his bare feet a pair of ordinary rubber overshoes, a sensible precaution if one intends to walk through damp and perhaps snake-infested grass. On the garden terrace he found Chateau. Constantine Ivanitch Chateau, a subtle and charming scholar of pure Russian lineage, despite his surname, derived, I am told, from that of a Russianized Frenchman who adopted orphaned Ivan, taught at a large New York university and had not seen his very dear Pnin for at least 5 years. They embraced with a warm rumble of joy. I confess to have been myself at one time under the spell of angelic Constantine Ivanitch, namely when he used to meet every day in the winter of 1935 or 1936 for a morning stroll under the laurels and nettle trees of Grasse, southern France, where he then shared a villa with several other Russian expatriates. His soft voice, the gentlemanly St. Petersburgian burr of his R's, his mild, melancholy caribou eyes, the auburn goatee he continuously twiddled, with the shredding motion of his long, frail fingers, everything about Chateau, to use a literary formula as fashioned as he, produced a rare sense of well-being in his friends. Pnin and he talked for a while, comparing notes. As not unusual with firm-principled exiles, every time they met after a separation, they not only endeavored to catch up with a personal past, but also sum up by means of a few rapid passwords, allusions, intonations impossible to render in a foreign language, the course of recent Russian history. 35 years of hopeless injustice followed a century of struggling justice and glimmering hope. Next they switched to the usual shop talk of European teachers abroad, sighing and shaking heads over the typical American college student who does not know geography, is immune to noise, and thinks education is but a means to get eventually a remunerative job. Then they inquired about each other's work and progress, and both were extremely modest and reticent about their prospective researches. Finally, as they walked along a meadow path, brushing against the goldenrod toward the wood where a rocky river ran, they spoke about their healths. Chateau, who looked so jaunty, with one hand in the pocket of his white flannel trousers and his lustring coat rather rakishly opened on a flannel waistcoat, cheerfully said that in the near future he would have to undergo an exploratory operation of the abdomen, and Pnin said, laughing, that every time he was x-rayed, doctors vainly tried to puzzle out what they termed a shadow behind the heart. Good title for a bad novel, remarked Chateau. As they were passing a grassy knoll just before entering the wood, a pink-faced, venerable man in a seersucker suit, with a shock of white hair and a tumefied purple nose resembling a huge raspberry, came striding toward them down the sloping field, a look of disgust contorting his features. "I have to go back for my hat," he cried dramatically as he drew near. "Are you acquainted?" murmured Chateau, fluttering his hands introductively. "Timothy Pavlovich Pnin, Ivan Ilyich Grameniev, Moyo Pogtinia, my respects," said both men, bowing to each other over a powerful handshake. "I thought," resumed Grameniev, an circumstantial narrator, "that the day would continue as overcast as it had begun. By stupidity, po gluposti, I came out with an unprotected head. Now the sun is roasting my brains. I have to interrupt my work." He gestured toward the top of the knoll. Then his easel stood in delicate silhouette against the blue sky. From that crest he had been painting a view of the valley beyond, complete with quaint old barn, gnarled apple tree, and kine. "I can offer you my Panama," said kind Chateau. But Pnin had already produced from his bathrobe pocket a large red handkerchief. He expertly twisted each of its corners into a knot. "Admirable, most grateful," said Grameniev, adjusting his headgear. "One moment," said Pnin, "you must tuck in the knots." This done, Grameniev started walking up the field toward the Cecil. He was a well-known, frankly academic painter, whose soulful oils Mother Volga, three old friends, lad, nag, dog, April Glade, and so forth, still graced a museum in Moscow. "Somebody told me," said Chateau, as he and Pnin continued to progress riverward, "Eliza's boy has an extraordinary talent for painting. Is that correct?" "Yes," answered Pnin. "All the more vexing, timbole obidno, that his mother, who I think is about to marry a third time, took Victor suddenly to California for the rest of the summer, whereas, if he had accompanied me here, as had been planned, he would have had the splendid opportunity of being coached by Grameniev." "You exaggerate the splendor," softly rejoined Chateau. They reached the bubbling and glistening stream. A concave ledge between higher and lower diminutive cascades formed a natural swimming pool under the alders and pines. Chateau, a non-bather, made himself comfortable on a boulder. Throughout the academic year, Pnin had regularly exposed his body to the radiation of a sun lamp, hence, when he stripped down to his bathing trunks, he glowed in the dappled sunlight of a riverside grove with a rich mahogany tint. He removed his cross and his rubbers. "Look, how pretty," said observant Chateau. A scoreful of small butterflies, all of one kind, were settled on a damp patch of sand, their wings erect and closed, showing their pale undersides with dark dots and tiny orange-rimmed peacock spots among the hind wing margins. One of Pnin's shed rubbers disturbed some of them, and revealing the celestial hue of their upper surface, they floated around like blue snowflakes before settling again. "Pity Vladimir Vladimirovich is not here," remarked Chateau. "He would have told us all about those enchanting insects. I have always had the impression that his entomology was merely a pose." "Oh no," said Chateau. "You will lose it some day," he added, pointing to the Greek Catholic cross on a golden chainlet that Pnin had removed from his neck and hung it on a twig. Its glint perplexed a cruising dragonfly. "Perhaps I would not mind losing it," said Pnin. "As you well know, I wear it merely from sentimental reasons, and the sentiment is becoming burdensome. After all, there is too much of the physical about this attempt to keep a particle of one's childhood in contact with one's breastbone. You are not the first to reduce faith to a sense of touch," said Chateau, who was practicing Greek Catholic and deported his friend's agnostic attitude. A horsefly applied itself blindfold to Pnin's bald head, and was stunned by a smack of his meaty palm. From a smaller boulder than the one which Chateau was perched, Pnin gingerly stepped down into the brown and blue water. He noticed he still had wristwatch, removed it, and left it inside one of his rubbers. Slowly swinging his tanned shoulders, Pnin wadded forth, the loopy shadows of leaves shivering and slipping down his broad back. He stopped, and breaking the glitter and shade around him, moistened his inclined head, rubbed his wet hands, soused in turn each armpit, and then joining both palms, glided into the water with dignified breaststroke, sending off ripples on either side. Around the natural basin, Pnin swam in state. He swam with a rhythmical sputter, half gurgle, half puff. Rhythmically, he opened his legs and widened them out at the knees, while flexing and straightening out his arms like a giant frog. After 2 minutes of this, he wadded out and sat on the boulder to dry. Then he put on his cross, his wristwatch, his rubbers, and his bathrobe. 5. Dinner was served on the screened porch. As he sat down next to Bolotov, he began to stir the sour cream in his red boltvinia, chilled wheat soup, wherein pink ice cubes tinkled. Pnin automatically resumed an earlier conversation. "You will notice," he said, "that there is a significant difference between Levolyan's spiritual time and Vronsky's physical one. In mid-book, Levolyan and Kitty lag behind Vronsky and Anna by a whole year. When on a Sunday evening in May 1876, Anna throws herself under that freight train, she has existed more than 4 years since the beginning of the novel, but in the case of the Levolyans, during the same period, 1872 to 1876, hardly 3 years have elapsed. It is the best example of relativity in literature that is known to me." After dinner, a game of croquet was suggested. There are people favored the time-honored but technically illegal setting of hoops where 2 of the 10 are crossed at the center of the ground to form the so-called cage or mousetrap. It became immediately clear that Pnin, who teamed with Madame Bolotov against Shapolyansky and Countess Poroshin, was by far the best player of the lot. As soon as the pegs were driven in and the game started, the man was transfigured. From his habitual, slow, ponderous, rather rigid self, he changed into a terrifically mobile, scampering, mute, sly-visaged hunchback. It seemed to be always his turn to play. Holding his mallet very low and daintily swinging it between his parted, spindly legs, he had created a minor sensation by changing into Bermuda shorts expressly for the game. Pnin foreshadowed every stroke with nimble aim, taking oscillations of the mallet head, then gave the ball an accurate tap and forthwith, still hunched, and with the ball still rolling, walked rapidly to the spot where he had planned it for it to stop. With geometrical gusto, he ran it through hoops, evoking cries of admiration from onlookers. Even Igor Poroshin, who was passing by like a shadow with 2 cans of beer he was carrying to some private banquet, stopped for a second and shook his head appreciatively before vanishing in the shrubbery. Plaints and protests, however, would mingle with the applause when Pnin, with brutal indifference, croqueted, or rather rocketed, an adversary's ball, placing in contact with his own ball, and firmly putting his curiously small foot upon the latter. He would bang at his ball so as to drive the other up in country by the shock of his stroke. When appealed to, Susan said it was completely against the rules, but Madame Shapolyansky insisted it was perfectly acceptable and said that when she was a child, her English governess used to call it a Hong Kong. After Pnin had told the steak and was all over, Varvara accompanied Susan to get the evening tea ready. Pnin quietly retired to the bench under the pines. A certain extremely unpleasant and frightening cardiac sensation, which he had experienced several times throughout his adult life, had come upon him again. It was not pain or palpitation, but rather an awful feeling of sinking and melting into one's physical surroundings. Sunset, red bowls of trees, sand, still air. Meanwhile, Rosa Shapolyansky, noticing Pnin sitting alone and taking advantage of this, walked over to him. Sidite, don't get up, and sat down next to him on the bench. In 1916 or 1917, she said, you may have had occasion to hear my maiden name, Jeller, from some great friend of yours. No, I don't recollect, said Pnin. It is of no importance, anyway. I don't think we ever met, but you know well my cousins, Grisha and Mira Belochkin. They constantly spoke of you. He is living in Sweden, I think, and of course you have heard of his poor sister's terrible end. Indeed I have, said Pnin. Her husband, said Madame Shapolyansky, was a most charming man, Samuel Leboyich, and I knew him and his first wife, Svetlana Shartok, the pianist, very intimately. He was interned by the Nazis separately from Mira, and died in the same concentration camp as did my elder brother Misha. You did not know Misha, did you? He was also in love with Mira once upon a time. Che Gotov, tea's ready, called Susan from the porch in her funny, functional Russian. Timofey. Rozhoka. Jay. Pnin told Madame Shpolyansky that he would follow her in a minute, and after she had gone, he continued to sit in the first dusk of the arbor, his hands clasped on the croquet mallet as he still held. 2 kerosene lamps cozily illuminated the porch of the country house. Dr. Pavel Antonovich Pnin, Timofey's father, an eye specialist, and Dr. Yakov Grigorovich Belochkin, Mira's father, a pediatrician, could not be torn away from their chess game in the corner of the veranda, so Madame Belochkin had the maid serve them there on a special small Japanese table near the one they were playing at, their glasses of tea in silver holders, the curd in the way with the black bread, the garden strawberries, zimlianika, and the other cultivated species, klubnika, hot boys, and green strawberries, and the radiant golden jams, and the various biscuits, wafers, pretzels, Zweibacks, instead of calling the 2 engrossed doctors to the main table at the other end of the porch where sat the rest of the family and guests, some clear, some grating into a luminous mist. Dr. Belochkin's blind hand took a pretzel. Dr. Pnin's seeing hand took a rook. Dr. Belochkin munched and stared at the hole in his ranks. Dr. Pnin dipped an abstract Zwieback into the hole of his tea. The country house that Belochkins rented that summer was in the St. Baltic resort, which the widow of General N. let a summer cottage to the Pnins on the confines of her vast estate, marshy and rugged, with dark woods hemming in a desolate manner. Timofey Pnin was again the clumsy, shy, obstinate 18-year-old boy, waiting in the dark for Mira, and despite the fact that logical thought put electric bulbs into the kerosene lamps and reshuffled the people, turning them into aging emigres, and securely, helplessly, forever wire netting the lighted porch, my poor Pnin, with hallucinatory sharpness, imagined Mira slipping out of there into the garden and coming toward him among tall tobacco flowers whose dull white mingled in the dark with that of her frock. This feeling coincided somehow with a sense of diffusion and dilation within his chest. Gently he laid his mallet aside, and to dissipate the anguish, started walking away from the house through the silent pine grove. From a car which was parked near the garden tool house, and which contained presumably at least 2 of his fellow guests' children, there issued a steady trickle of radio music. Jazz, jazz, they must always have their jazz, those youngsters, muttered Pnin to himself, and then turned into the path that led to the forest and river. He remembered the fads of his and Mira's youth, the amateur theatricals, the gypsy ballads, the passion she had for photography. Where were they now, those artistic snapshots she used to take? Pets, clouds, flowers, an April glade, with shadows of birches on wet sugar snow, soldiers posturing on the roof of the boxcar, a sunset skyline, a hand holding a book. He remembered the last day they had met on the Neva embankment on Petrograd, and the tears and the stars and the warm rose-red silk lining her caracul muff. The Civil War of 1918 to 1922 separated them. History broke their engagement. Timothy wandered southward to join briefly the ranks of Denikin's army, while Mira's family escaped from the Bolsheviks to Sweden and then settled down in Germany, where eventually she married a fur dealer of Russian extraction. Sometime in the early 30s, Pnin, by then married too, accompanied his wife to Berlin, where she wished to attend a congress of psychotherapists, and one night, at a Russian restaurant on the Kurfürstendamm, he saw Mira again. They exchanged a few words. She smiled at him in the remembered fashion from under her dark brows with that bashful shyness of hers, and the contour of her prominent cheekbones and the elongated eyes and the slenderness of arm and ankle were unchanged, were immortal. And then she joined her husband, who was getting his overcoat, at the cloakroom, and that was all, but the pang of tenderness remained, akin to the vibrating outline of verses you know, but cannot recall. What chatty Madame Spolyansky mentioned had conjured up Mira's image with unusual force. This was disturbing. Only in the detachment of an incurable complaint, in the sanity of near death, could one cope with this for a moment. In order to exist rationally, Pnin had taught himself during the last 10 years never to remember Mira Bolochkin, not because in itself the evocation of a youthful love affair, banal and brief, threatened his peace of mind. Alas, recollections of his marriage to Liza were imperious enough to crowd out any form of romance, but because if one were quite sincere with oneself, no conscience, hence no consciousness, could be expected to subsist in a world where such things as Mira's death were possible. One had to forget, because one could not live with the thought that this graceful, fragile, tender young woman, with those eyes, that smile, those gardens and snows in the background, had been brought in a cattle car to an extermination camp and killed by an injection of phenol into the heart, into the gentle heart one had heard beating under one's lips in the dusk of the past. And since the exact form of her death had not been recorded, Mira kept dying a great number of deaths in one's mind, and undergoing a great number of resurrections, only to die again and again, led away by a trained nurse, inoculated with wilt, tetanus, bacilli, broken glass, gassed in a sham shower bath with prussic acid, burned alive in a pit of gasoline-soaked pile of beechwood. According to the investigator Pnin had happened to talk to in Washington, the only certain thing was that being too weak to work, though still smiling, still able to help other Jewish women, she was selected to die and was cremated only a few days after her arrival in Buchenwald, the beautifully wooded Grosser Eritzberg. The region is resoundingly called. It is an hour's stroll from Weimar, where walked Goethe, Herder, Schiller, Wieland, and the inimitable Kotzebue and others. Aber warum? But why, Dr. Hagen, the gentlest of souls alive, would wail, why had one put that horrid camp so near? For indeed it was near, only 5 miles from the cultural heart of Germany, that nation of universities, as the president of Wayndale College, renowned for his use of the mot juste, had so elegantly phrased it when reviewing the European situation in a recent commencement speech. Along with the comment, he paid another torture house, Russia, the country of Tolstoy, Stanislavski, Raskolnikov, and other great and good men. Pnin slowly walked under solemn pines. The sky was dying. He did not believe in the autocratic God. He did believe dimly in a democracy of ghosts. The souls of the dead, perhaps, formed committees, and these, in continuous sessions, attended the destinies in the quick. The mosquitoes were getting bothersome. Time for tea. Time for a game of chess with Chateau. That strange person was over. One could breathe again. Strange spasm was over. One could breathe again. On the distant crest of the knoll, at the exact spot where Grameneve's easel had stood a few hours before, 2 dark figures in profile were silhouetted against the somber red sky. They stood there closely, facing each other. One could not make out from the road whether it was the Poroshin girl and her beau, or Nina Bolotov and young Poroshin, or merely an emblematic couple placed with an easy art on the last page of Pnin's fading day.